Hello guys, let's talk this time about the pawn breakthrough. Let's ask the questions to know if the pawn breakthrough is good or not and how to do so. We'll be talking about such topics as what is a pawn breakthrough, what is the difference between a pawn breakthrough and a pawn break, another one, what is the pawn breakthrough and where it is not possible to make it, what is needed to have the pawn breakthrough possible, what is the goal of pawn breakthrough, what concepts are helpful to use in pawn breakthrough, and the last one, what happens if there are no pawn breakthrough. Let's get into it. Let's start with the first position. As we can see, at this moment, we will not have the opportunity to make a breakthrough due to the specific idea. What is this idea? The pawns are fixed. As you can see, as long as the black pawns are standing on the same position, white pawns cannot advance. Therefore, at this moment, no pawn breakthrough. Therefore, we cannot make this position winning. Let's get into the next position. At this one, as we can see, there is some tension between the pawns. White pawn can capture the black ones, and black ones is protecting the ones that can be captured. Therefore, if white starts with the pawn captures, there is the pawn threatening to capture and the pawn advancing. But of course, black can recapture, and this moment we get another type of pawns that are fixed. Therefore, at this moment, we cannot improve the position even further. Of course, if white pushes the pawn forward by b6, we have the same position. There is no pawn breakthrough available. And now, next position. Now we can see there is the tension between these pawns, white and black. And now at this moment, we can at least try to create a little bit more chances to get the winning position. If white starts with the pawn captures, at this moment, as we can see, the pawn can either capture the pawn on c6, either advance moving forward over the d file. Now, if black recaptures the pawn, as we can see, the pawns on the d file are fixed, and the pawn on b7 and b5 are not fixed as yet, but they cannot make a breakthrough. Therefore, if white advances the pawn, we have another position that both pawns of both pair of pawns actually cannot make any changes. Of course, we can get a little bit different. At this moment, if they would capture with the pawn onto the b5, as we can see, the white pawn can get into the promotion a little bit faster than black, because black pawns needed to make more moves into the promotion, and that's why at this moment, as we can see, white pawn advance into the back rank and promoting to the queen with check. Therefore, it is the position that white wins. Therefore, at this moment, we can see this option. Of course, there is one more option. We need to have a look. After the pawn captures on b6, if the pawn recaptures on c4, it is another winning position because the white pawn is more advanced than black's. And most important, both pawns advancing to the back rank, they are getting into the promotion with check. Therefore, if white to play captures, the pawn move forward, the pawn promote winning. Of course, at this moment, at this specific idea, they could even push the pawn forward, it's winning as well. And after the pawn moves forward, we are going with check first, and the pawn cannot advance any further. We just grab the pawn and we are winning. Therefore, at this moment, we have more chances to win if black goes wrong. But if black is not going to go wrong after the recapture that we are expected to, the position is still drawn. And now another position. This time we have one contact between the pawns that can change the pawn structure. If white pushes the pawn forward, both pawns on the c and d files are fixed, and therefore at this moment the only way to change the pawn structure is to try to make the lever with the b4, b5 breakthrough. And now, if black makes any moves at this moment, let's say with the king, then white try to either advance the king up to the capture the pawn that is not protected by any other pawns, or after they try to get the other way, for example, if they push the pawn forward the same as previous example, this time they lose. Why is that? Because after the capture on c4, the pawn will be quicker into the promotion with check than the white's counterpart. If white captures, of course, black recaptures immediately, and the same position arises. Therefore, at this moment, white cannot make a breakthrough with b5 due to the pawn capturing on c4 and getting closer to the promotion. Of course, white king cannot catch this pawn on the c file. And now let's talk about the V structure. What is the V structure all about? First of all, V structure shows that all of the pawns are fixed with this specific shape. It is the V-shaped letter, therefore it's very easy to understand it. And what's more important, at this moment, if you do not have any pawns over the adjacent files, we cannot make any pawn breakthrough. Therefore, it's one of the easiest positions to understand, as there is no pawn breakthrough, only the kings can change the position. Another one, at this moment, as we can see, we have the V structure, but black pawns are not with the V structure fixing whites completely. Therefore, at this moment, we can try to think a little bit of pawn breakthrough. If it is successful, we'll see in a moment. And now, as we can see at this moment, we have the reversed or flipped the V structure with white, but black's pawns are pretty much solid, and therefore, at this moment again, as long as these pawns are standing in its place, the pawns on the C and D files, the only way to make a breakthrough is to attack the pawn C6 with the pawn B5. And now, after B5, it loses because of the same idea as previously. If pawn captures the pawn on B5, as we can see, the king cannot approach the pawn square, and therefore it's winning with black. It's winning with black after they capture the pawn, of course, and now if they try to get closer and closer, the pawn promotes, and after that we are just winning queen and pawn versus king and two pawns pretty easily. Of course, if black would try to say, you can even try to make a breakthrough, unless you capture my pawn, I capture yours, they can get the following. Moving with the king, and then after they capture, black recaptures, and again we have the pawn structure that cannot be broken as long as we do not have any pawns on the adjacent files to make the contacts with the fixed pawns of blacks. Therefore, the position still is a draw. Next position. Previously, we had the pawn structure with the V letter. Both of the pawns were with the V letter. This time, we just pushed back the pawn a little bit back. And now, what happens at this moment? If white pushes the pawn forward, reaches this V structure by both of the sides, of course, the position is completely locked. The pawns cannot advance. And now, if they capture the pawn with the pawn D to the C6, they recapture the same way. For example, if the pawn moves forward, it's going to be win for white. Therefore, they cannot recapture with the B pawn. They must recapture with the D pawn. And after recapture with the D pawn, again, the pawn structure cannot be changed by any moves by the pawns. Only the kings can decide. At this moment, the position is still drawn. This time, we just pushed back the pawn from the B6 to B5, seeing what would be the change. The change is practically speaking none, due to the same idea as previously. After the pawn captures again, black cannot recapture with the D-file pawn because of the pawn from D6 advancing very quickly to the promotion. Therefore, they must recapture the other way with the pawn from the B-file, making this pawn structure that neither of the pawns can advance as long as any other pawns are making a breakthrough, attacking the pawns that are fixed. Therefore, the position is still drawn. Another one. This time, we do not have the V structure by both of the sides, but we have the pawns that are a little bit down. At this moment, the pawn, instead of D5, is on the square D4. And how does it change the nature of the position, you may ask? Let's check it out. After the pawn moves forward D5, we have the contact to make at least possible captures of the other pawns. And now, if they try not to make any capture, as long as white is not making the capture, if they are moving with the king, now, after the capture, again, we need to have the symmetrical pawn structure. Therefore, black must recapture with the d-pawn, and the position is still drawn. And now, let's check it out. What would happen if black would capture with the pawn from the c6? At this moment, there is, at least technically speaking, the chance to make a little bit of changes. But at this moment, if the king advances, the king gets closer. And after the king gets closer and closer, the position is still drawn due to the ideas that neither of the side can make a breakthrough. Of course, if black pushes the pawn and black just takes the pawn on the c5, then the position is still drawn due to the idea that we are working on previous time. For example, after the pawn forward, this moment is going to be a mistake because of the pawn breakthrough. And now, as you can see, the king cannot get closer. The threat is to capture and move forward. And after this pawn capture, the pawn advance, and this is the game over. And therefore, at this moment, after the king gets here, they cannot move the pawn forward. They can either go with king f6, and after this one, they can just repeat the position. Take notice the king cannot advance even further. And of course, after this one, we are just having king e8, And now, even though they advance even further, but with the help of opposition, black still draws this position. Therefore, the chance to win is not big unless black knows what they do. And that's why at this moment there is not possibility to make a breakthrough. But let's check out another variation. For example, at this position, if we played the pawn on d6, at this moment, the pawn d6, it's still losing as we just mentioned before. And if we play king f6, just going back and forth, after this one, as we just mentioned, still draws due to the opposition. Therefore, no chance of winning. And that's why at this position, after d5, if black captures the pawn, it's a draw. If black gets king g8, it's still a draw. And now another position. This time, let's check it out. The pawn that was previously on the v structure on the square b6, previously b5, and now the pawn b4. What's going on? If we push the pawn forward, it loses due to the pawn structure, pawn box. As we can see, the pawn will be advancing to the b1 square without the opportunity for the white king to catch it, therefore it loses. But even if black doesn't want to capture the pawn as long as white make its owner capture, they can just still draw this very easily. After the capture, we have recapture, the pawns are still fixed, therefore no pawn breakthrough possible. And now to show you the idea how this position can be drawn, we can use the concept of opposition quickly. Now at this moment, white gains the opposition, but they cannot penetrate the opposition. They cannot get closer due to the pawn d7 controlling the square e6, and after some of these moves with the kings back and forth, we are seeing that the position is still drawn. The position is still drawn not just to the concept of the opposition, but lack of the getting through the opponent's position. Therefore, no penetration is at this position is possible by white's king. And now another pawn structure. Previously, we just had two pawns that were fixed. This time, there is just one pawn fixed on the c-file, and these pawns are pretty free to either push forward, either to capture the pawn in the middle. And now, let's check it out what would happen if this is white to move. After the captures, again, black needs to recapture the same way not to allow any pawn breakthrough. At this moment, after the capture with the symmetrical structure, the position is still drawn. And after the recapture, again recapture, and there is a draw due to the opposition. As we just know, this is the position that is drawn. Let's check it out what would be if this position would just play a little bit different. At this moment, again, we try as black to capture the pawns the same way to get the symmetrical structure if we want to make the position drawn. And after another capture, the position is still drawn. Of course, white has different ideas to make this position again as well. After pushing the pawn forward and the pawn captures, this is the position as we just analyzed in the previous example. Of course, if J play the pawn d6, it is lost due to the pawn captures on b5, as we just seen this previously. Of course, even if white pushes the pawn forward, trying to induce some errors, as long as black is not capturing the pawn from d-file to allows the pawn to advance, if they capture the right way, again, this pawn still gets to the promotion because the white king cannot get into the square of the pawn. Therefore, the position is winning, but for black. Now, let's check it out. What happens if we have the reversed V structure? With the reverse V structure, as we can see, the pawns are with the V-shaped letter, but this time they are reversed. You can say they are flipped or reversed. And now it's still a draw. Neither of the pawns can make any pawn breakthrough. At the same time, if the king cannot capture the pawn that is not protected by any other pawns, and if the king cannot infiltrate into the position, then the position is still drawn. Another one, at this moment, as we can see, let's check it out. What happens if the pawn would be not on the square b5 with the V-shape reversed structure by both pawns, but by the V-shape with only black, and white pawn is a little bit down. After the king gets closer, we are having the opposition. After the pawn moves forward, the king gets here. Take notice that after the king gets there, trying to infiltrate, it's not possible due to the king getting into this way and then making the opposition diagonal one. And after the king gets here, again, the diagonal opposition saves black. And even if they try with the normal opposition, so-called the vertical one, then it is still a draw, because now it's black that doesn't allow white to penetrate the position even further, especially if they cannot get into the square d6 due to the pawn. Therefore, the position would be drawn. And now another idea. Previously, we just pushed the pawn from the square b5 to b4, and now we have the pawn on b5, but the pawn on d4 is just removed. And now, as you can see, this is still a draw, because this is the same type of analysis as previously. For example, if white tries to get closer, black replies with the opposition. After they closer, they replies with the opposition. And now the last move was done by white, sorry, therefore white gets the opposition. But it's not winning as long as black is playing correctly. Even though black loses the opposition for a while, but after white tries to get from the other side, black reaches still the opposition, this time the diagonal one. And after these moves, as we just previously see, the king cannot infiltrate the position even further, the position is still drawn. And now another position. Now let's check out what would happen if we just move back the pawn from the middle of the pawn structure up to the square c5 from c6. If white is to move, if they capture the pawn, of course black must recapture because there is the threat of capturing the pawn and moving forward, as long as pushing the pawn forward without the capture, promoting in the next two moves. After the capture, still there is the pawns that are fixed, and now the position is still drawn. Of course, if white plays a little bit different, if they capture the other way, black recaptures the same style, and now the position is still drawn. And the last idea is to push the pawn forward, reaching the double V-structure pawn with white and black, and therefore it's still a draw as long as white cannot penetrate further, and this is the same analysis as we previously saw. And now again, this time let's check it out what happens if we have the V-structure against the V-structure reversed but not closed. Not closed means that one of the sides or both of the sides can at least make the pawn break. Of course, the pawn break doesn't mean the position is winning, it means that there is some position to make the capture by either of the sides. Now, if white moves the pawn forward, at this moment the only way to move the pawn forward is just to push the pawn to the square c5, black can recapture both ways. And now, this loses as black gets the protected pass pawn after capturing either from the d file, either from the b file. For example, this one is winning because now the king, even if the king can get into this pawn box, the king gets into this one and captures this pawn, winning. If the other pawn captures from this side, it's the same. The pawn cannot make a breakthrough because from pawn c7 is having the control on the square b6. Therefore, both options wins by black. And now, even if black didn't want to make any capture, as long as white doesn't make their capture, they can still draw. And now, after the capture, recapture, it's still a draw. And of course, if they capture the other way, black recaptures and it's still a draw. Of course, with the idea of opposition, the position is still drawn because white king cannot infiltrate the black's position. And now let's have a look with this type of structure with two pawns versus two. As you can see, if both pawns are fixed, if the king cannot infiltrate, the position is still drawn, using the concept of opposition, most precise, not allowing the stronger side or most active side to infiltrate into the position to capture the pawn that is not protected by any other pawns. This position is of course still a draw. And now if the two pawns are on the board but one pawn has the opportunity to capture, as long as there is not additional idea, the position is still drawn. After the captures, we have one pair of pawns with the fixed position and therefore the position is still a drawn. Of course, if white pushes the pawn forward, we have the previous position as we just discussed, draw as well. And now if we have the pawn not on b5 but on b4, as we can see, one pair of pawns are fixed and the other pair of pawns can try to make some kind of captures. If white pushes the pawn forward, after the capture by the pawn, this is lost for white because of the lack of catching the pawn that is going to promotion. Of course, if the black says we are not going to make any captures as long as you do not make the captures, if they make with the king, after the capture they must recapture and then the game is still a drawn due to the opposition. Of course, if the king gets closer, opposition again, not allowing the king infiltrate, and most especially now the king cannot get into d5 square due to the pawn. Therefore, the position is still drawn. And now let's check it out what happens if we have two pawns by white, two pawns by black on the same files, but neither of the pawns are fixed. Now at this position, white has two possibilities to make the contacts with another pawns. The first one is pushing the pawn b6, Now the threat is to capture and promote. Of course, the king is too far away from catching the pawn, therefore black needs to react, and black can react both ways. Either they push the pawn forward to fix both pawns forever, or they can capture the pawn diagonally, and after the recapture, it is still a draw. Therefore, at this position, a draw, we cannot do anything. Of course, if white tries the other way, with the c6, it's the same idea, to make the threat of capture and promotion, and of course, if black makes the idea to capture the pawn diagonally, it's still a draw after capture and capture, or if they block the pawns forever, it's the same, a draw in each of the instances. And now let's check it out. What happens if one of the pawns is closer to the other pawn with the contact? As we can see, white pawn can capture black and black pawn can capture white. The difference is the following. If white pawn captures black, just one square to the promotion and the pawn cannot be stopped, especially as the king is too far away. If black pawn captures, white can always recapture, therefore a huge difference. Of course, if white to move, if they capture, it's winning because the next move is the promotion, especially at this with check. Of course, if whites try to play the other way, it's the another opportunity to win this position with playing b6, having two contacts and two threats to capture the pawns and pushing the pawns forward. It is not possible to stop. If they capture this way, we can capture and promote, or we can push the pawn and then promote as well. And if they capture the other way, if they capture from the b file, again the same idea. Either we capture and promote next move, either we push the pawn forward and then promote. Both ways wins. Therefore, at this position, if white is to play either pawn capture, either pawn move forward, wins easily. And now what happens if the pawns are next to each other with the most dynamical interactions? Both pawns of white can capture black and both pawns of black can capture white. The most dynamical options for the pawns is shown here. If white to move, of course, they can capture the pawn from b to c file and then promotion next move. Of course, they can get the other way, capturing the pawn from c file to b file and promoting next move. At this moment, very easy position, win is easy. Another position, this time a little bit more advanced, but you can check it out very quickly that it's not so difficult. We can see the advantage of the pawns. At this moment, the most important is that the pawn that is sitting on the square f5 doesn't have its counterpart on the same line. It is the crucial idea. And now what to do? At this moment, white plays the pawn forward, pushes the pawn with the threat of capture and promotion, and what is important, black cannot capture the pawn due to the protection of the white pawn. And now there are just a few scenarios how black can continue. If they capture the pawn, white pushes the pawn forward, another idea of capturing the pawn and pushing the pawn forward, or pushing the pawn forward without the capture up to the promotion line. If black captures, then we are going forward with the pawn. Therefore, these two pawns were just sacrificed in order not to allow blacks to interact with the white pawn reaching the promotion square. And now it is winning because black king cannot reach the square of the pawn that is going to promotion. Therefore, the first idea. What would be another idea, you may ask? After the king e6 trying to block these pawns, we can just capture. Of course, the threat is to promote in one move. Therefore, the only way to stop it is king f7. And now the pawn is attacked by the king. In order not to lose it, h6 to protect the pawn. And now after king g8, you can say that the pawn h7 is fixed. And if you just approach the king too close from one of these squares highlighted red, then the king is stalemated because the king cannot get to f7. But of course, it's not a draw because white has another idea to make this position winning. First, they approach the king closer, and now they cannot get into e6 due to the stalemate, but they can use the pawn to make the contact with the fixed pawn. And this is the winning plan. g6, and with this idea, as we can see, black king cannot get into f7 due to the white's pawn. The only legal move is to capture the pawn, and then the h6 pawn will be free to move. Enough after the first capture, the king approach closer. At this moment, the king cannot get to f7, but it can either go with the h7 or moving with the pawn. And now, if the pawn moves forward, we are going closer with the idea of capturing the pawn. If the pawn moves to the promotion, we are just not catching the pawn, but we are checkmating with two pawns on the 7th rank. Very important checkmate pattern. And now another idea, if we just push the pawn forward, if the king gets to h7, we are going f7, and again, there is no legal moves accept capturing or pushing the pawn forward. And now if the pawn moves forward, we just simply promote. After the king captures, it's a checkmate. And the other way, if the king captures, we just promote. And if the pawn moves forward, we are going with the checkmate in 1. Therefore, in both instances, the position is 1. I hope you like this idea, because it's one of the common examples in the pawn endgames. And now let's check out another position, this time with the pawns in a little bit different structure. Take notice there are 3 pawns on A, B and C files by white and by black. First contact is the contact that the pawn b5 can capture the pawn a6, therefore we need to get another one. Why? Because after the capture and the recapture, the king will just capture those 2 pawns and black will be winning easily. Therefore, the most advanced pawn is the pawn c5 that can reach the pawn b7, that is the most far away from the black skin. Therefore, this is the winning plan. Pushing the pawn forward, and with the pawn structure that is not symmetrical, because at this moment both pawns can capture on different lines, as we can see, we can have the reaching position. Why? The threat is to capture and move forward, therefore black needs to do something with the pawn. If they capture with the pawn, as we can see, the pawn is not protecting the a6 pawn any longer, and after the capture the pawn gets to promotion, the king is too slow to catch the pawn. Another solution for black would be to push the pawn forward in order not to allow to capture. But of course, pushing the pawn b6 doesn't make the protection for the a6 pawn, and therefore very similar idea applies, and the pawn promotes next to move, white is winning. Therefore, at this position, due to the dynamic opportunity, white wins by playing the pawn c6. And now one more position. At this moment, as we can see, there are 2 pawns that are fixing the pawns of white and black, therefore 2 pair of pawns that are fixing each other, and now the 1 pawn that doesn't have any pawns on its path. What to do? At this moment, we just push the pawn to open up the access for the most advanced pawn b5, and what is important, the king is too far away. For example, if you draw the square of the pawn at this moment, the king cannot approach the pawn because the king is too far away, therefore we make a pawn breakthrough. Now, the pawn moves forward, and there are 2 threats, either to push the pawn up to the promotion line without capture or with capture. Both plans would be winning because black king is too far away. Now, we expect that black captures the pawn, pushing the pawn forward by both sides, so-called pawn race, and very important feature. Now, the pawn promotes to queen with check before black does the same, and that's why it's winning very quickly. Now, let's get into the summary of this pawn break or pawn breakthrough. What needs to be done in order to be able to know if the pawn breakthrough or pawn breaks is possible? I'll just give you some tips to consider because they are pretty useful, and I guess you will use it and apply in your games, winning more games, especially in the endgames. First, try to identify the pawn that doesn't have the opposing pawn at the same file. Why? Because it is already a potential passed pawn. Another way to make it happen is to try to get rid of controlling guard pawn by attacking that pawn with another pawn. This time you are just making the more attacking opportunities, and you can make the pawn break easier. Another way is to make the attacking 2 pawns at the same time with some kind of pawn fork, but with the, let's say, various configurations, because this creates double threat and significantly helps to create a passed pawn. Therefore, another way how to do so in a more efficient manner. And now, next is to try to create as much pawn tension as possible in order to make a pawn breakthrough, the rule of double attack. The more tension, the more opportunity to capture the opponent's pawns is in the position of the pawns, the bigger chances to win this pawn endgame with creating a passed pawn and promoting. Another way is to check out what pawn break makes the passed pawn the farthest from the opponent's king. Use the outside passed pawn rule. Why is that? Because the farthest away the pawn from the king, the easier it is to get to the promotion without assisting the pawn and without being worried if your opponent's king can capture the pawn before it gets the last rank. Make the pawn race and try to create the passed pawn that promotes with check. Especially it is important because whoever does that as the first mostly wins. This is the rule of the last rank or the diagonal, because you need to check out if the pawn after the promotion attacks the king into these lines. Another way to make it easier is to try to think about the idea that sometimes having so-called double pawns help to cut off the king before reaching the pawn box. Therefore, a very important idea of restricting the king. Another one is when you are defending side, try to fix all of the pawns or create the V or the reversed V pawn structure that we're talking about, because this makes your opponent unable to make a pawn breakthrough. Of course, it is simply eliminates double attack as well, therefore it's easier to make a defense that you can hold the position easily. And the last one I would like you to consider is the idea that if the opponent's king is very close to the pawn group, either you need to create a pawn obstacle on the diagonal pawn box, or you need to use other ideas to win the pawn endgame. If you cannot do so, probably the pawn endgame is a drawn, especially you cannot make a pawn breakthrough, and therefore you cannot win this. I guess it's going to be pretty helpful, and I keep fingers on you to apply it in your games.